So maybe I'll get across to Dublin sometime this year. Hopefully. Oh, you see thumbs going up.
Yeah, I can see thumbs as well, not mine, but I would, if I'd worked out how to do thumbs, say, yes, that'd be lovely to see you in Dublin. I think it's not as bad as it has been. I think the movement of people is going to ease a little. Hasn't been great at the beginning of this year. Now there was a few people that were trying to travel that I think particularly if they got caught up in the US wasn't particularly easy, but I'm hopeful. So yeah, it'd be lovely. It'd be great to see you in Dublin. Might see Ruth Edwards as well. Maybe get to see her in Dublin too. I see her. She's got a new fancy job.
Yeah. I don't envy her task, but
yeah, it's an interesting one.
Okay, so we'll make a start. So good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. I hope you're keeping well. Welcome back from the break. I hope everybody's enjoyed the time you had off over the new year. First of all, I want to apologize for the incorrect link that was sent out for this event. We're using a new registration system. The new registration system was supposed to simplify the registration process, but it seems in this case it's complicated things. But we will resolve the issue before the next event. So first of all, good evening, everyone, and I hope you're keeping well. Before we start today's event, I'd like to draw your attention to the website where we've updated the events page with a schedule of very interesting events coming up this semester, starting off with today's event, the power of patient and public involvement, which is a very relevant topic for the Qatar health system that's looking to develop in this regard. Following today's event, we will continue with our bi-weekly events. So the next event will be in 2 weeks' time, which will be Connected Health for Clinicians beyond the virtual consultation. So this will focus on telehealth and digital applications used in this domain. Okay, so we are slightly delayed, so we will make a start on today's event. Today we have Professor Judith Strawbridge joining us from Ireland, and we will give a brief introduction to her in a short while. Today we have moderating the event, we have Professor Derek Stewart, who's Qatar University Health College of Pharmacy Professor of Pharmacy Practice. We're very happy to have him joining the team today and moderating the event. So as always, this event will be streamed live on YouTube, and we'll be monitoring the chat throughout. So if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat, either on WebEx or in on YouTube, and we'll be putting questions to Professor Judith throughout today's session. So we look forward to your interaction. So without any further ado, I will now hand the microphone over to Professor Derek, who will introduce today's event. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zach. I'm delighted to be here this evening and to be moderating the session, which is afternoon time across with Judith. Delighted to do it for several reasons. One's the topic, but more importantly, the moderator. I know Judith very well from working with her, collaborating in education and research, and she's also a really good friend of mine. So I'm really delighted that she's here today, and we're really fortunate to have somebody of her caliber. Judith is based at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. She's lead for patient public engagement, hence the reason that she's doing this talk today. She's got many other roles. She's the deputy head for the School of Pharmacy and Biomolecular Sciences in the university, and she's an associate professor of pharmacy practice. Now, she's got extensive leadership in designing, delivering, assessing, and evaluating teaching and learning for all healthcare professionals. So she's got a vast spectrum of experience around healthcare, education, and then patient public involvement in relation to that. Now, inspired by her clinical experience in her educational research, she's always been passionate about providing students with the best patient-centered education for professional practice. Layered on top of that, she then, for a long time, has advocated for the involvement of patients in educational delivery and has deepened that involvement at the university, in terms of curriculum design and academic governance. As I say, she's the lead for patient and public engagement across the university, and the strategic aim there is really to deepen patient engagement across both education and research. She's also engaged in that at a national level for undergraduate and graduate training. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Professor Judith, and just encourage, as Dr. Zach has said, please use the chat function. I'll probably keep the chat till the end of the session, but if there's anything that I think is particularly useful to put to Judith as we're going through, I will do that. So really over to you, Judith, and I look forward to your talk.
Thanks very much, Derek, for that very generous welcome. And I think my favourite part is to be considered a good friend of yours. To everybody there, I say marhaba and welcome, or as we like to say in Ireland, Céad Míle Fáilte, which is actually 100,000 welcomes. So very welcome to this particular CPD event, which I do have a huge passion for. And I do think that there is great power in having patients and public involved in everything that we do. So by the end of this session, I am hopeful that what you'll be able to do is describe what patient and public involvement is and what it isn't, and identify how to involve patients and the public in healthcare research and education, which I am presuming that you as healthcare professionals, many of you will be involved in those elements within your work in terms of research and education, but we'll have a think as well at the very end about how it might be important in service delivery as well going forwards. And patient and public involvement can be done well. And when it's done well, that involves us having knowledge, skills and attitudes to make that magic happen. So really effectively, this session to bring you on a journey and to think about opportunities that you may have in your own professional lives to involve patients and the public in education and in research. So the plan for the session is to start in the research domain, because that's where PPI is more defined, and it's much easier to answer questions around what it is and where we involve people and why we do so. And I'll take you through that research journey. And then I will take you on a journey through PPI in education too, which I think is longer in the making. I think we've had patients and public involved in education for a lot longer, but not as well defined. And give you some examples of how we at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland have been looking to embed PPI strategically in both research and education, and hopefully plenty of time for discussion. Looking forward to seeing those questions that you may have in the chat, and through Prof. Derek to have a good discussion on CM. So starting with what it is. What is PPI? And let's think about the research journey first. So this is the traditional research cycle, which I presume you'll be familiar with, where we as researchers and healthcare professional researchers identify the areas that we believe need to be researched. We design the project accordingly with the appropriate methodology. We carry out that project, and often that project in healthcare sphere will involve patients and the public, but as participants. So in terms of clinical trial participants, or perhaps we're gathering data, really that's a traditional place that patients and public fit in the research. We then, as researchers, analyse that results and we present and we publish them. That's very typical, and I don't expect that has done anything other than resonate with where most of us are at in terms of our research. In terms of definitions, there's a lot of discussion in this area about what all these different terms mean, starting with participation. And I'm going to go through them, but I'm going to also say that whatever we call things, I'm not as concerned about definitions, as long as we have a shared understanding of what we mean. and to be aware that we can have these definitions, but they may mean different things in different parts of the world. For the purposes of this talk, and I suppose essentially where we're at in Ireland as well in terms of definitions, we typically use the term participation as being part of the research, really as part of the data of that research, being a participant in clinical trials, etc. We tend to use the word engagement as a whole in Ireland about talking to people about the research, trying to involve people in learning more about what research is and the impact that it might make in open days, social media and science festivals, etc. Sometimes we use the word engagement, meaning involvement. And involvement is where people are really part of the research team, involved in all stages of the research cycle. There really aren't too many other synonyms that you can come up with, to be honest, after participation, engagement, and involvement. Subtly, this is what most people mean when they say them, but to be aware that sometimes they're used interchangeably and in different contexts. So it's always about what exactly we mean. And in terms of patient and public involvement, the accepted definition that was first derived by involved in the NHS in the UK is research being carried out with or by members of the public rather than on, about, or for them. And this is quite widely adopted across quite a number of countries to succinctly say, really, it's not about participation and being the data source. It's about actually being truly a partnership with people that are researching and being part of the team. So if we look at that research cycle again, and I have borrowed this from our Health Research Board in Ireland, where they have identified where patient and public involvement can happen, they've effectively said it needs to happen at all stages of the research cycle. And in terms of identifying and prioritizing the research, that we should have people actually saying, well, what they want researched. A really good example of where this maybe didn't go so well, if we think in the healthcare context, is the challenges of the adoption of inhaled insulin. And despite the amount of investment that was put into the process and all of the research in developing that modality, the researchers fundamentally didn't talk to patients and the public about the challenges of using insulin and its injectable form, and what sort of barriers there might be to using an inhaled insulin. And I think we can probably agree that to date, the use of inhaled insulin didn't really take off due to, I would say, lack of patient and public involvement in identifying and prioritizing the research. People can be involved in helping design the project, and co-design is where you really have patients and public involved as members of the team helping design the project. And one really important aspect is also to potentially assist with recruitment. And where you have patients and public involved as team members helping to think about how to recruit, there is good evidence and data to say that that really improves recruitment of participants. In terms of undertaking and management of the research, it's now considered best practice to certainly have patients and public represented on project steering and governance groups. In some cases, people in a co-design environment go further and have trained up and have people assisting in collecting data, carrying out interviews, etc. And that partnership also in some cases being extended through to analysing and interpreting data. When it comes to dissemination, there's knowledge shared on where best to publish findings and present them, and also helping write up. And certainly more recently in my research, I've had members of patients and public involved in helping write up data and are named contributors as authors on publications. And that's where we're headed and moving towards a full PPI. What was missing in the traditional cycle was this implementation bit, and I mean that is a phase that I think could be considered traditional, but think strengthened when we had patient and public involvement in thinking about how impactful the research is going to be and how it actually does change practice. To give you some context to this image as well, our Health Research Board, which funds quite a lot of healthcare research, will effectively not fund unless there's adequate plans for patient and public involvement. And all of the large programme grants now are assessed by members, patients and the public. There's a separate assessment undertaken in that regard, and there are an analysis really done of how much patient public involvement it has been embedded in and how authentic it is. And unless it's top notch, then it's not being funded. So it very much is a question now of not do you do patient and public involvement in healthcare education and clinical research. It's a case of you won't get funded if it's not done adequately. So essentially, why do we involve patients and the public? Three really main attributes of improving patient and public involvement, and that's to improve the quality of the research, to improve the relevance, and to improve the impact. And there is increasing amounts of literature coming out to demonstrate just how patient and public involvement does all of those. And indeed, the impact of PPI is under intense scrutiny. And certainly in Ireland, we now have PPI Ignite, which is a health research board funded research across all of the universities in the country, working together to actually embed PPI appropriately across all research and to measure its impact. So how do you find the right people? So how do you find people to be involved, patients and the public, to be involved in research? There are a number of different ways and routes to find people. So that can be done through national organisations. So for instance, we have organisations such as IPOSI, which are representing patients and advocacy domain, and they have conducted training. So if you have somebody that you can find through an organisation like that, there's the added value of the fact that they'll have considerable training and orientation in the research domain. Patient advocacy groups are very keen to get involved as well and are reaching out to universities and to healthcare professionals who are researching to see if they can work together and how they might contribute. With all of us being healthcare professionals, we do have, if we have clinical engagement with people, we have a bank of people that we actually look after essentially, and we can actually give opportunities to people and extend invitations to those that might be interested in becoming involved. And another route, which is becoming more prevalent now, I suppose is the word to say, is social media, where people have reached out to generally to find folk to help in research. But I suppose that all comes along with finding the right people. And it's really about building relationships. The right people are the people that are going to work well within the team, that have the expertise that's needed, and who are either open to training or have sufficient training to be able to conduct those roles, and can therefore partner with us in meaningful involvement. So in terms of how you involve people, what do you need to know? So I did say that I discussed knowledge, skills and attitudes, And you need to know about patient and public involvement and some of the principles that are involved. And one is that we need to have meaningful involvement versus tokenistic. So instead of, oh yeah, I've got patients involved, I asked them once about a question, and you know, that's patient and public involvement. That is not acceptable, nor is it acceptable anymore to imagine that it's all going to be done voluntarily by people. So meaningful involvement means that it needs to be actively planned at all stages of the research cycle, or as many as applicable. And to appreciate that all are partners with experts with different experiences. So to be mindful that there can be a perceived power differential, particularly when you've got healthcare professionals with status and titles, etc., all working together on a shared problem, to be aware that the expertise provided by patients and the public is important and critical, and essentially we all have something to bring to the table. And to do that effectively, that means that space needs to be a safe, open and inclusive environment, mindful of that. Often there's a recommendation to have more than one person present so that there's peer support, so that it's not typical really in a research team environment anymore to have just one patient or public representative. Typically, you would have two for that support. And also to think about things like accessibility, to be aware that actually sometimes it's more difficult for people to be involved. Perhaps we're not going to be as inclusive in terms of things like disability. Maybe there's challenges in getting to the environment, needing to be aware of caring responsibilities and more difficult scenarios. So we need to be mindful as well about bringing people to the table in a very inclusive way. In terms of the support required, typically in the research space, there's some training requirement. It might well be an orientation around what type of research it is, but certainly the more removed from patient-facing research it is, the more people might require orientation. So if it's very much bench type research that is translational, but very much at that sort of science base, that might need more orientation, clinical trials, so on and so forth. And there are specific training programs available to upskill people who have got an interest in contributing. And the challenging issue around budget. I think for a long time, patient and public involvement was very much done on a voluntary basis, and there hadn't been sufficient budget set aside. But now there's an expectation emerging, certainly in Ireland, that there would be a budget set aside for it, for appropriate recognition of the value of the expertise. And where we find that particularly difficult at the moment is if you have a grant, then you put in an appropriate budget for the PPI element, but you won't get the grant unless there's appropriate PPI. So funding that element of research can be a real challenge. And having, again, if you've built up appropriate relationships, it's easier to explain, you know, that challenging space. Just checking there, was that a hand up for a particular question to jump in there, or can I plough on ahead?
Yeah, please continue.
Lovely. So yeah, because normally budget is just the one space where I do get asked loads of questions. So it's a challenge. Budget is a challenge. So what I've done there is kind of put together some of the things that you need to find out about, know about before starting the journey of successful PPI. And you can see there how they mirror in some of the attitudes that have been defined that need to be employed in terms of a culture, a research culture of wanting PPI and seeing the value of it, respect, openness, and being really setting up for power sharing. And some of those attitudes have been really evolved through work I'm doing again in a national environment, where as part of the PPI Ignite network, there is a whole work package on defining the training that's required for us as researchers, undergraduate and postgraduate level, on knowledge, skills and attitudes. And those attitudes are some that were defined by that group in some initial work at outlining the knowledge, skills and attitudes. And then we're going to build on that, looking at learning outcomes. This is a slide from some of the work that we've been doing as that team. And this is really just the brainstorming exercise of what skills do you need to implement PPI. And many of us around the table writing on virtual post-it notes that were then sorted by the team into these various different skills. And you can see there the range of skills that are needed to actually undertake PPI well, and how many of them are involved really in the communication space. Basic communication skills, particularly around listening, you see coming up there as themes, but sustaining relationships. So really working to provide that environment that's open and trusting and supportive, and to then facilitate those conversations. So facilitation skills are key. All of this is set within a framework of project management and how we actually bring in PPI, all these different stages of the process, and as individuals, how we ensure that we developed, like this particular session for you, that you're undertaking your CPD, to think about how we actually develop our skill sets to be open and learn about patient and public involvement. So just a pause, I suppose, for a couple of moments for me to suggest to you that if you research, have you got a culture of embedding PPI in all stages of your research cycle? Because it may be that we're not all there at this stage yet. This is very much a journey, and we are certainly at different stages of that. Some people have started to involve people, others have more fully embraced all of the training that's been required to upskill and have people well involved in all stages of the cycle, and knowing that we need to do that, particularly in our context, to get funding. So just a moment for you to think about that and think about where you might go for, if you haven't done this and you'd like to do that, there's certainly lots of resources out there to help us in our journey for PPI. It is a global expanding field. Moving on then to PPI and education, if I may, and if there's loads of research questions, maybe we can take them all at the end if there's none emerging just right now. And certainly this is me in my very much comfort space, thinking about PPI in education. Although a little bit more challenging to answer the question of what is PPI in education, because education itself is so diverse. And we have, say, for instance, PPI cannot be done in people studying alone. That maybe that we've got students looking at case-based learning. Is that PPI? Is bedside teaching PPI? What happens when we've got large groups, small groups, online? And what about the bigger issues about involvement at a wider area, sort of governance and also in curriculum design? So what is PPI in education? And that's something just to get you starting to think about what it is and isn't. Helpfully, I can actually give you some information in terms of a recent BME review. So Best Evidence in Medical Education, BME Systematic Review. published by Mars Gordon and team in 2020. So a recent publication, and this focused on medicine only, and essentially was a review of the literature to determine where we have patient involvement in medical education and try to determine, I suppose, what is the value of that and how do we move forward in this space. What was interesting to me is that they used in their definition Child's taxonomy for the spectrum of involvement, and that was actually built on some work from Chu as well, who looked at patient involvement in education as a growing involvement, almost portrayed, I suppose, by both as a linear fashion, that there's less involvement in case-based teaching, but it's the place where people start. That using simulated patients, so people that are taught to portray a particular type of condition but may not have it, that are brought in as simulated patients. We use sim a huge amount in Ireland. Progressing to what's sometimes termed as real patients. I try and avoid the term real patients because I think we're all real people, no matter what role we're playing in the education space, but people that can share their stories about their condition and bring something to life that a textbook can't. There are, I suppose, people involved, both patients and public involved in teaching and assessment, and I think they've delineated that from co-teaching, which is next, in terms of it's more directed by faculty. In terms of assessment, this may be, for instance, in OSCE exams, where for many years now we've been asking our patients and sim patients to give the students a mark from that perspective as well, and included it in the overall assessment. Co-teaching is where you have patients and the public co-designing the learning outcomes and the intention and the session and developing it together. And then what was regarded as the highest level of involvement, or the deepest, maybe is the best way to express it, deepest level of involvement, is that where it permeates institutionally and that people are involved in curriculum design and in governance in issues such as advisory boards.
Hi, Judith, can I just bring in a question at that point that's come in there around assessment? Yeah. How do you quality assure that around using patients or members of the public to assess, particularly if it's a summative assessment that's going to count, and how do you standardize that?
Well, we particularly use it in the summative assessments, and particularly in high stakes summative assessments as well. And essentially there's quite a bit of literature on this and how it is appropriate to ask patients and public involved in teaching and assessment. But you do have to remember what you're asking them to actually assess, in that it's very much within their gift to assess. How did the person make you feel? Did you feel that you were going to go and ask the question of the GP? Did you feel reassured by this advice? How did you feel or respond, or so on and so forth? So that makes the quality assurance of it a little bit more tangible, in that it's not were they right or were they wrong. You know, perhaps if you were determining from the patient what the desired outcome was, that would be a problem. But you're generally asking about communication skills, empathy, those types of things that patients and public are very well able to assess. And in truth, the overall marks that are awarded to that are part generally within something like an OSCE, which is objective, structured, clinical examination. Part of the objectivity is to have lots of different perspectives. So if you have the perspectives of all of the different assessors and indeed all of their different patients and sim patients, it only adds to the matrix of people that have been involved in decision points, and generally not a huge portion of CM
Yeah.
Where we have used it, I suppose, in non-summative but formative assessment, it's been really helpful because we have people that are involved in giving some feedback, and that's been very, very powerful. That does require people to be a little bit more comfortable around assessment and around giving feedback, and that sometimes requires a little bit of training in terms of how to do that appropriately. So we have used it in both ways, but I have no hesitation in it being used in the high stakes assessment in that context of where your patients and the public are actually the experts in that space.
Okay.
How did this person make you feel? How was their communication? Was it clear? That type of question.
Okay,
Does that
thanks, Judith.
answer?
Yeah, thank you.
And Judith, sorry,
Lovely.
just to follow on from that question. So in the implementation of that, did you experience resistance from faculty or students, or it may have not been students, it could be postgraduate learners, for example?
So essentially, I suppose we introduced it both undergraduate and postgraduate, and in truth, and for somebody who's very involved in student engaged learning as well, don't think we had the discussions with students to say whether it was going to be introduced and this was a change or not. We have had discussions with students saying this is the they are aware that that patients and sim patients provide a view, but it was presented to them as a fait accompli, as an expert view. Certainly, they have been very receptive to getting formative feedback. And we know that in particular because students also are involved in things like reflections, where they reflect on some of the teaching that does involve patients and the public. And they would sometimes provide their patient feedback as evidence in terms of in the reflective cycle of how things are improved. So yeah, we haven't had a huge amount of discussion about bringing it in, but in truth, we've had it in for such a long time that maybe my memory fails me a little as well, but I think we just did it, to be honest.
I guess just one further question before you continue. So I'm thinking within the CED realm, if you like, and the use of Ppi of patients to advance clinical skills, not just within educational institutions, within, say, for example, hospital institutions who are offering CPD. Have you come across examples of where that has worked well?
It's really interesting that you say that, because I have done some separate research on how to develop patient pharmacist communication skills, and undertaken a realist review in that space, which was led by Aisling Kerr, PhD student, and we did intend for that review to cover all elements from undergraduate through to practicing pharmacists and CPD. But when we actually came to look at the literature, we have a lot less literature in the CPD space. So there's just not the same amount of literature out there in looking at patients and public involved in teaching and assessment in that space. And for me, it's a case of it hasn't been done, as opposed to a case of it's not a good idea, if you see what I mean. But I just haven't come across the same amount of literature. And I think that probably reflects current practice, where we don't have patients and sim patients involved in CPD as much as we could do. I think it's a real opportunity.
Thank you.
Or maybe it's that they are involved and we don't publish it. So we're maybe starting to involve patients and public in the research and not researching them being involved in the research and the education. So it might be that it's happening and it's not appearing in the literature.
Yeah, it's an interesting bit, because although I've done research first and then I'm looking at education second, of course, my passion, as you know, is to research education. So this is where the two combine. And certainly when you look at that BME review for a start, that is looking at undergraduate medical education and only coming up with, really a small enough number of studies. I'm sure they're quite delighted in their systematic review in terms of the workload, but it doesn't necessarily, I think, potentially reflect the practice. I suspect there's a lot more PPI involvement in undergraduate than there is in CPD, but absolutely there's a publication bias in that educators don't publish generally at half enough, quarter enough. So it is an interesting one. And this spectrum of involvement is interesting because that's what they defined a number of years ago. And I think we need to think about this really in a larger context. And essentially, that's why we go back to the why do we involve patients in the public and education. This absolutely can be in the CPD space as well. And if we go back to Osler, we're looking at Osler's anniversary being like more than 100 years ago. For all of you that are involved in medical education, will be very familiar with Osler, who really said to study books without patients is not to go to sea at all. And I think that's effectively the big issue, is that you can't really teach somebody to be a healthcare professional without meeting patients. And when you do, it's incredibly powerful. So if I think back to my undergraduate education days in a fantastic institution and a brilliant curriculum, I effectively met one patient once on my journey through to be a pharmacist. And unbeknownst to my good friend, she became a SIM patient in a particular session as well. So I distinctly remember that the pharmacologist borrowed her to stand at the front to show that somebody of her height and size was likely to have side effects of hydroxychloroquine, given how small she was. And that stayed with me from then. And the other patient I met had Parkinson's, and I interviewed them as part of my research, and I've never forgotten them, nor what they had to say. So it's really, really powerful, and you can't study healthcare professionals without meeting people. That's just that's the truth. In terms of the BME take-home messages, so when they looked at the literature with respect to medicine, it was very much about empathy, understanding, and improved communication. So they did have hard findings that they did make a difference. And in terms of the right people, again, it's about building relationships. So maybe, you know, you've met somebody, maybe that person is useful in both research and the education space. Are they comfortable talking to folk? And if they are, they generally probably don't need a huge amount of training. We've asked people in some of our research, you know, what sort of training would you need or want? And there is a challenge, I suppose, in keeping it authentic and keeping it real. So particularly in the education space, and say somebody was to be involved in coming to class and really effectively storytelling, giving their view and their perception, the more training they have, the more challenging it might be to actually really feel that authentic experience. So it's a bit of a professionalism issue, that it's called the Professionalization Paradox, where you can overtrain people. And certainly those that were coming in to do storytelling, or for instance, the people we have here, some of our lovely SIM patients, really wanted an orientation of what were the expectations of a session. Some people who felt a little that they needed to have more confidence said they would benefit from seeing a session done just to see what it looked like, maybe a buddy type system, but maybe a slightly different sort of like orientation required to somebody that's maybe getting involved in clinical trials research design, who might need to know what a clinical trial is. Coming along and being involved in education might actually require different needs. It is all about relationship building. That to me is the key take home. You've got the right people when you know you have the people on your team that work really well.
Judith, can I just ask you about that as well? I mean, you have for research and education defined good, what the good looks like. What about the bad? And are there examples where the good is actually not good when you go to use them and how you handle that? Or is it always perfect?
No, life isn't perfect. So, and essentially, you'll notice terminology that I've used like successful PPI and when it goes well. And you do have a risk when you work with people that something may not go well. And certainly, somebody's motivation to undertake this type might influence your outcome. Generally, we find through research the biggest motivator is to want to either give back because of a good experience with healthcare services or want to re-educate because of bad experience with healthcare services, but particularly the first, to be honest, having had a good experience. But you could have on occasions issues where someone's personal beliefs may not align with current evidence-based practice. We've seen that before. So somebody that may advocate, I suppose, say in this current environment, you know, you could be running a PPI session on immunology, and if you happen to have somebody who wasn't pro-vaccination, they may have a whole myriad of information to impart that may not be on message. So one of the key things is about how we partner. So it's again this relationship that actually when you're there and you're facilitating any education experience, if it doesn't go to plan and there are some messages that are challenging, then you can either address that there and then, or if it's more appropriate, have debrief sessions with the students afterwards, exploring why do people have these views? What do you think are the challenges with them? So it's not necessarily that it's always perfect, but it has the potential to be fabulous. And you do need to have the mechanisms in place in terms of how you partnership and how you prepare for when things don't go right, to be able to manage that situation and ensure that it still ultimately ends up a positive learning experience for the students.
Thank you.
So in terms of thinking about how we actually involve people, I thought it might be helpful to share some of our experiences from our university. And some time ago, the dean put into our strategy a deepened patient engagement. That's actually the official term. So I've gone / involvement for the sake of how we define things, but our strategy is to deepen patient engagement. And really, I suppose, to give you some context of that is really where we are in Ireland with the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. This is actually a university. It's the size of a single faculty. It was original remit was to train surgeons, as you might imagine. It is the largest medical school in the country, but also teaches pharmacists and physios at undergraduate level, and is responsible for a lot of professions at postgrad level, including large body for nursing, etc. Everything that we do in our college is patient-centered. This is from our strategy, whether it's undergraduate education, postgraduate, professional training and CPD, or research. It's all about the person, and our mission is to place the patient at the center of all that we do. So when you take that into context, to deepen that engagement does seem to be appropriate. But where it's grown over the last few years, it has gone very much from being a nice to have to a need to have. So back in 2017, we were unlucky not to be part of the first PPI Ignite, where there was funding to involve the public in the research process. So we weren't part of that, even though it's everything that we do. And the strategy to involve us was in 2018. And now 2021-22, it's an expectation. It's an expectation by our professional bodies for research, and it's an expectation from grant funders, and effectively they won't fund it in the healthcare space if PPI is not embedded. And luckily, we also in 2021 did become part of PPI Ignite when it was expanded in that year. So it's really the best way I can just describe PPI in Ireland currently is that it has exploded. It's just imperative in both domains. And we had 5-year goals, and this was published last September on Action 13. And we have done a lot of things. We conducted baseline surveys about education. We've done them in research as well. We've done a lot of benchmarking and gap analysis. So I was reaching out to lots of other institutions to see where that has happened. An application to join the national network. And in 2021, we did receive a considerable amount of funding from the Health Research Board, and now are part of the National PPI Ignite Network, who are busy really looking at lots of institutional policies and procedures that will be aligned across the country. And we are growing patient and public involvement in education and trying really, I suppose, and this is where it's really helpful to be talking to you all, to really try and see if we can spread that message. In terms of in education, the survey exemplars, we've had patients and public involved in our curricula design. We undertake research into PPI and education and have published in that domain. We've managed to pivot during COVID to still include PPI, and it's actually been even more inclusive for some people who find it difficult to get into college and find it not, so it's actually suited some people better. And national involvement, I'm involved in IPOSI. We're trying to set a subgroup up from our Irish network and healthcare educators for PPI. And I'm also involved in PPI Ignite in developing training. So you can see over the last 5 years, strategically, we have undertaken quite a development. And these are just a selection of some of the papers that we have published in that space in terms of involved in curriculum design, online, and more recently, the key stakeholder views and experiences, which was undertaken as a qualitative study and helps us shape our strategy going forwards. So how do we involve people? And effectively, I have highlighted all of these because we do all of the above. So we have case-based teaching. That's our fundamental modality for how we teach in our school in pharmacy, but also in medicine. And to take it a step further in terms of PPI, where they have now started to involve patients and the public in looking at the cases that we've produced. So quite often we would have been creating and using cases that we felt were authentic based on our healthcare professional background, but were we sense checking them? Were we getting people to contribute? We teach using simulated patients extensively. We have patient storytellers in all of our systems-based modules. We have patients and sim patients involved in teaching and assessment, both formatively and summatively. We have good examples of co-teaching, admittedly in specific areas, and particularly in mental health. And that would be because I think PPI has been better developed in mental health, and mental health is very, very difficult to teach without PPI because it's just nigh near impossible to translate those experiences and to address issues like stigma without having real people to help you design and create and do that. We have had people involved in our curriculum design, and I'm happy to say that our external advisory board has PPI members there too, and they are important in our strategic planning within our school. So we've involved people everywhere. And I suppose the thing I don't see about that is that it's a linear progress. I think they're all really important. I don't want to say that, you know, it's much more important to have someone on an advisory board because that's deeper than case-based learning. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. So at the moment, we're actually reimagining what PPI in education might look like and trying to define it. And we're defining it through a group of interested people that met through an educational session for our Irish Network and Healthcare Educators. So it's IPOSI, it's patients, it's educators, and we think that one of our biggest jobs that we should do is to start to reimagine and redefine it. And it was our patients that said they really felt our students should have mentors and that there should be patient mentors. It's very hard, as we know, if any of us that have ever researched, to have an original thought, I have to say, because there is some evidence of patient mentors being seen in the literature, particularly if you look at the longitudinal placement type literature, where sometimes there is a patient mentor there that people follow up longitudinally throughout the course of their experiential learning. Certainly the model that was used in Harvard, people connected with one particular patient. They met with them regularly. They followed them up with visits to their home. If they happened to go into hospital, they'd go see them there, and they engaged with them for a longer period of time. And I'm really keen on developing the idea of patient mentors, and I've suggested that we have learning communities going forward, so that we would have patient and public champions of those learning communities and people that would maybe stay longitudinally. I've also put another box there in purple for the things that we haven't thought about yet, or maybe I haven't even researched them properly. Like certainly there have been cases of patients, the public being involved in interviews for admissions to healthcare professional courses and so on and so forth. Maybe that needs to talk about CPD and where we're involved there. And I've put both experiential learning and case-based learning to the side. And you'll see case-based learning in the middle as well, in that I think case-based learning can be lots of different things to lots of different people. I think we should be aiming to have more patient public involvement in authenticating these cases, to also maybe go deeper in getting videos of people as opposed to just flat cases where possible, and integrative cases. And experiential learning sort of sits to the side in that if you look at any of the PPI literature, it tends not to discuss it because they say it's not particularly involved. You happen to be in hospital and you happen to have your history taken. But from all of my discussions with patients over the last couple of years, I can tell you that that's not always a satisfactory experience for those patients, and that sometimes they don't like being known as the cooperative person in bed 6 that will let you take history after history. Sometimes they want to actually be able to give a little bit back, to give some suggestions to whoever's taking the history, to have been asked, to have been a little bit more involved. And I think that's something that all of us as healthcare professionals who actually look after students on experiential learning can maybe think about a little bit, that to involve somebody in that as opposed to have them participate might be something that would really improve the outcomes for both the person having their history taken and also for the students that could maybe learn a little bit more by having a couple of minutes conversation about how their approach made the person feel, or the things that they missed or didn't pick up, because there are different ways to answer the questions and ask them. So you can see that this is currently a work in progress at national level, which I think is quite exciting, because I don't think that it is a linear relationship of involvement. And I think that we need to be imaginative about how we best involve patients and the public in how we educate our healthcare professionals and continue to educate them. I think that CPD aspect is very underutilized at present. So again, a time just to press pause and think about you educating healthcare professionals. I expect that many of you do that, because where we have got healthcare students, we need people that are healthcare professionals teaching them. So I suspect that many of you do. And do you have a culture of involving the patients and the public in that education process? Do you use those experiences to be as meaningful as possible for the students who will be our healthcare professionals of the future? And essentially, for those of you that are thinking, well, you know, I don't do much research, or I don't do much education, I'm presuming that all of you are involved as healthcare professionals in service delivery, and it's something I haven't even touched on. But I think what we've had is a tradition of really thinking about how we provide healthcare services, and we've dipped a toe in the water in terms of things like patient satisfaction surveys. But how does that really help us improve our services? How is that as meaningful in terms of a methodology as it could be, when maybe we might find maybe a more mixed methods approach more helpful to really get some deep information about expectations that people have, and indeed maybe managing those expectations in a dialogue fashion. So I think the same principles apply. There's certainly a lot of literature out there on patient and public involvement in improving service delivery, and listening to people and engaging with them to find out how better we can meet the needs of patients and the public in our care. So to summarize, I would say that we have patients and public to be involved in educating healthcare professionals and shaping research is integral. To involve people in research, you get more relevant research and improved outcomes. There is data on that. Involving people in education motivates students, demonstrates relevance, and develops key skills. And there's data in that too. And there's data in that beyond medicine. There's data in other places like social work. There's some data to say that that is followed up after graduation. And it's not easy, as you would imagine, to look at that research and to demonstrate that, to be able to attribute, you know, the effects of a particular intervention at education, which is so multifactorial. But effectively, it's not really in question that involving people in research and education improves both. There are other questions about how much it improves them or how best to do it, or, you know, but it's not really in question anymore that it does improve it. And the other thing that I believe is the take-home point is that an authentic partnership is the key to successful and patient public involvement, not tokenistic, not using people, but having them involved in partnership with you to really improve research and education. That is it from me, or Sinead, as they say in Irish.
Or shukran, as they say in Arabic, to say thank you. Thank you for that, Judith. Just as people are typing their questions, just a few things I was going to pick up on. To me, that stuff, myriad between research, education, service deliveries, it's really all the same thing, because we can't have research without thinking about education. We need the service delivery to research. We need to educate people in the service delivery and so on. So all seems the same spectrum really there about involving patients and the public. Are there any issues I could imagine in countries and settings where this is just starting? Managers and institutions thinking, this is great because I can save money. I won't need as many faculty to teach. I won't need as many people on my service design because I can bring in all these patients to replace it. Have there been any issues around that, and how would you recommend that we would deal with that if that comes up? I just remember from my own background in other universities, when we brought in problem-based learning, it was the thought, well, that's fine, we will reduce the number of lectures, we won't need as many people to teach, and actually it increased that requirement. So, I mean, to me, this is not a way of reducing other parts of the system. Have you any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because my experience has been quite the opposite. It has been a concern that it's going to cost a lot more money. So that essentially, as opposed to a replacement, because everybody that comes in needs to be minded, you know, and as we said, for it to go right, you need to have that facilitation approach. So it's not a case of going, that's great, I have all these other people that can lecture for me and do small group work and, you know, so on and so forth. That's brilliant. We'll save on lectures. That's not been the way of it. And there has been a concern that, you know, if we are respectful of people's time and energies and so on and so forth, and we do need to remunerate, that has been really the major stumbling block into its progress. So certainly you would need to have an awareness that this doesn't come without an economic consideration. Certainly the budget that was required to set up a really thought through and sustainable. And I think sustainability is a word I can't believe I haven't used much, but it's kind of one of the key points, is to sustain this type of involvement for things like, say, our bank of simulated patients. That required contractual provisions. It required, you know, training. It requires people to maintain and know this bank and to understand who could possibly be involved. And that all takes both time and money. So there's nowhere have I seen that it's been a suggestion that it might actually do the opposite. In truth, it is an investment. And interestingly, worldwide, some places invest more in it than others. There are some colleges that actually have employed patients themselves to do some of this liaison work, to be that person that recruits patients in public and trains them up. So there's any level of involvement, but generally to maintain and sustain relationships costs both time and money.
It's interesting because I was actually going to ask you about that, the economics of this, because, you know, you've given us lots of information about the evidence of benefit, which I was going to ask you about as well, but you've satisfied my curiosity on that there is a lot of evidence, or at least as much as the evidence has been published, but it's almost how much it has cost to get that benefit. And I think, you know, you've just discussed that. Have there been any studies that have actually looked at economics of this? And
there have been some that have touched on it, but generally, like anything to do with cost, often they're not well described, to be honest. So you've got two challenges. One is traditionally there has been some underfunding in this space, particularly in the education space, relying on volunteering and expenses only. And indeed, actually in the research space as well, there would have been a lot of reliance on expense only and volunteerism. So sometimes it's not well funded, and the other thing is that it's not well described in terms of the actual costs. And I find the same as well when researching things like OSCEs. Like, we know OSCEs cost a lot of money, but I can tell you the papers that have described the cost of OSCEs on my hand, you know, just a few of them. We just know they cost a lot, but no one likes to itemize it and write it down. And PPI is the same. It's not well described in terms of the economics of it, which is a challenge because if it's developing and it's new, a little bit like for anybody working in the healthcare system, the drugs budget is a target, and new drugs are going to get more scrutiny. I suppose, and the same thing in education, that, you know, bringing in guest lecturers or expert patients, if it's a new person and a new expense, that's going to come under more scrutiny, which is why it's really helpful to have an institutional policy around this and a strategic intent to embed it, because then it becomes something that you do as a priority, and it doesn't, it's not as open to those challenges. But no, I'm afraid when it comes to this, to the economics of PPI, I can't roll out the same length of the literature as I can for actual evidence of the impact.
Okay, thanks for that. Back to using PPI in research, are there any issues when, if we use them as data generators, data collectors, interviewers, they actually start becoming a participant as well? You know, I can imagine if you're doing, say, research on asthma and your PPI interviewer has got that condition. Now, that might happen with energy, whether they're a patient, public, person interviewing or not, but how do we sort of manage that bias that they might bring into things, almost speaking about me rather than the people that we want them to work with? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think that's part of the element of partnership, training, team, finding the right people. So in terms of all of those good things, they need to have attention paid to them. And if we're thinking about, say, that very scenario of interviewing someone and, you know, the chance of a personal bias influencing the research, as you say, that could equally be posed by any person that's on your team interviewing, and would be very much guided by the use of theme sheets and, you know, transcribing, looking for challenges, addressing them if you feel that the data quality hasn't got the integrity. In truth, I have more familiarity with people being involved helping design questions, recruitment, oversight in terms of governance, helping to disseminate and implement, rather than where there is sort of data gathering and analysis. But I do know that they are developing, and they are legitimate areas for involvement, and they are growing.
But I could also appreciate they maybe wouldn't be your first areas. It would be those other areas that were around recruitment, dissemination, you know, how do we get this message out to the general public, rather than bringing in, like, the first go we'll do is go off and do some grounded theory interviewing, might be a bit more challenging. Moving to the education, what about you know, real PPI around vulnerable groups? You know, young people, children, you know, you mentioned mental health, which is obviously potentially a vulnerable group, but other real vulnerable groups, you know, terminal illness, particularly thinking about adolescents and children. How do we manage that? Is there an evidence base on that? And I mean, I know we probably do it in terms of there's a child in a ward, go and, you know, listen to the chest or whatever, that stuff of involvement. That's not really what you're speaking about in terms of real involvement.
Yeah, we have, and I think that's a really important question, because it's actually thinking about those vulnerable groups and ensuring that we are including all of those vulnerable groups, as opposed to excluding them on the basis of some of the additional challenges that they present. We're really fortunate in terms of being a healthcare university. We, of course, have Department of Pediatrics, and our people that are involved there are actually passionate about PPI in both research and education. And there are ways that we have managed to effectively involve. And of course, it becomes an involvement then beyond the patients and the public, but their parents, guardians, carers, etc., to be fully involved in, you know, informing people what the process involves. But we absolutely have everything from little babies involved in bringing in for examinations and OSCEs. Also, we're lucky enough to partner with pediatrics and doing some online teaching, which was quite nice to have the consent and to take videos and so on and so forth, to get the maximum value from those engagements as well, to have those. So yeah, mental health pediatrics are very established in PPI, and there's 2 points that it raises that I'd love to raise, and one is about inclusivity and diversity. What we tend to find, particularly with our SIM patients, is that the majority of our SIM patients are comprised of people who maybe want to give a little bit back and maybe have a little bit more time on their hands. So our population tends to be an older population, particularly mature individuals, and may not necessarily be as representative of the entire population, often retired, bit of time, happy to give back. So a certain maybe not creating the full demographic. So we're currently undertaking a project within the SIM that's being led by my colleague in SIM, Claire Condren, to actually look at the portfolio of our SIM patients. And although we have smaller numbers of adolescents and people with, particularly with disabilities, is a challenge as well, to try and make sure that they're included. Also looking at cultural diversity as well, because that's a challenge too, and to make sure that all of those are included. The other thing that what you say raises me to mention that I think is important is what happens in terms of, you know, as you say, vulnerable in cases of terminal illness, etc. And that is the big challenge that we're looking at, working with people who, by the very nature of them being termed a patient, that they have periods of being unwell, being not available, limitations on their contribution, and unfortunately, where it's life-limiting challenges, to be aware when somebody is no longer with us. So unless you develop those relationships, you're at risk of contacting a family to see if someone's involved or able to help out in a teaching session. And unless you know your patients, they could have actually they may not be available because they've died essentially, and they may not be available because they're unwell. Can you imagine what it would be like for a family to be contacted and the person's no longer with us? So that's a challenge. It's also a challenge in terms of what people can do, for instance, being involved in assessing, in helping with long cases or OSCEs or the like, what they're going to be able to do within the bounds of their health, or maybe they might have to drop out at the last minute. So it's all complex, and that's why it comes down to my big point about building and sustaining relationships, because we do need to make sure that those that we do know our patients, and we do understand when they're going to be unavailable, or when we need to always have patience and to have a turnover. And the other thing about it is, it's coming up in the literature a little bit now too, is because of this professionalism paradox, where you've got somebody who's so trained that they become so expert in the field. There are some suggestions that maybe you should limit how long someone's involved in a particular exercise, so that maybe they're involved in a research team for a few years, and maybe then, instead of them being more involved in the next research team doing the next thing, maybe they might like to try their hand at governance of education or curriculum design, or otherwise we potentially have these potentially are using the same pool. So a very, very long answer to vulnerable poses some problems which we can overcome, but illness is a perennial problem that we need to think about and manage, and that diversity and inclusion again comes into it in terms of rotating maybe how involved people are and where they're involved.
No, that's really useful, because I think that inclusivity, diversity, I think that's really important that we don't exclude. I suppose as well, there's also the issue that if the students are working with terminally ill patients for quite a while in teaching, you might have to handle them and support them if that patient has died as well. Zach's saying there's 2 questions coming in from YouTube.
So yeah, the first one is, do you embed this topic of patient-public involvement in your undergraduate curricula?
So that is a really good question. The simple answer is yes. So we have started to teach our undergraduate students about patient and public involvement through our research modules. They're very aware of it through all the education because they're, involved, but we also have started to teach them. So we're very lucky. We've got people like my colleague, Dr. Michelle Flood, who has expertise in this area as well, and from her research who's been involved in helping teach our undergraduate students about patient public involvement. Wider as well, we've got Research Summer School for students, and this is a topic at Research Summer School, and there's teaching there. So and nationally, I'm sitting on the group that's looking at undergraduate and postgraduate education, and it's about educating our undergraduates and our postgraduates about PPI itself.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, so I think a lot of our participants today are clinicians. So the question is regarding how to transition from collecting patient satisfaction routinely to a more comprehensive way of involving patients in service design. So can you elaborate on the mechanisms that are in place for that transition?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's a question that I'm answering in theory as opposed to in practice, in that I haven't been involved yet in kind of looking at service delivery. But from the perspective of it, it's really answering a research question, isn't it? How can we, how can we improve our service to patients? And therefore, we can conduct it in that type of manner where it's conducted as a piece of research, where you look at developing a research team, finding out what are the areas that most need to be looked at, looking at potentially developing the questionnaires are one thing, but maybe having to explore in more depth when there are findings in a more qualitative way of looking for people to volunteer. And I mean, I would imagine that we could recruit patients and the public for service delivery in the same sorts of ways that we recruit them for any research in terms of call outs within a hospital for people to be involved, provide their view. Would you be happy to be in a focus group? Those types of things would all be potential ways that you could actually really involve people a little bit more in service delivery.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that point as well, maybe, I mean, people are attending today, clinicians are attending today because they've got an interest in this topic. So a facilitator for that transition would be themselves acting as advocates and champions for that transition within their own institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things. It's very simple in terms of to look at the parallels with things like interprofessional education. In terms of having champions, and I think we've certainly seen that having champions in interprofessional education is important. I think having champions in patient and public involvement has been really important. So I would agree with you. I think that would be a really good place to start, is to look at as people who have an interest in this field, exploring it and really reaching out and being active in that space.
Thank you. We're also receiving some very complimentary comments on your presentation today, Professor Judith. So
that was kind.
Many of the participants are saying thank you for such an interesting presentation. I think, Professor Stoke, do you have any more questions coming from your side?
No, I have no more questions. The only thing I'm just going to point out to the participants is that at Qatar University, we've got a formal agreement, a memorandum of understanding with RCSI. So we do have a link through to Judith and her wonderful expertise to maybe help us with some of these things if we're starting off, or increasing the amount that we're doing on PPI. So there is a formal link. But no, just to thank Judith. As I say, she's a good friend of mine. I've worked with Judith for a long time. I knew this would be a really, really good session, and I haven't been disappointed at all. So thank you, Judith, for that. And thank you on behalf of everyone here. And thank you, everyone, for coming along, posing the questions, but also go away and reflect on this, think about it. And I think we can always do more in terms of PPI in all our activities. So thank you.
Thank you. I think it's for me to say Masalama. Masalama.
Masalama.
Masalama. You know, it's all a work in progress, and you know, I don't really put myself out there as an expert in PPI. I very much put myself out as a champion, as someone who's passionate about it, and absolutely very happy to work with anyone who has got an interest in this field and point in the direction of where there are some really good resources and how to develop. So thank you very much. I really appreciated the invite.
Thank you very much. And just to close today's session, just one final thank you to Professor Derek and Professor Judith for making this today's session very interesting and interactive. For our participants today, the evaluation is now live on the website, so you can provide your feedback to us, and the registration for our upcoming events is also live. So we look forward to welcoming you in the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much again for joining, and we look forward to seeing everybody very soon. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Judith, I don't know if anybody's here, but have you seen the call out for the ESCP best practice papers?
I did see that call out.
Why don't you write one on PPI? All you need to do by the end of January is submit to the ESCP International Office an abstract of 250 words, and then we select from that for submitting a full paper, just describing the context of